Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been at your weakest, and work chose that exact moment to turn its back on you? Have you ever feared that while you were sick, vulnerable, or unable to defend yourself, a decision could be made that changed your entire life overnight? If you've ever experienced workplace injustice like that, or even worried it could happen to you, you're not alone. These workplace injustice stories happen more often than people think, and they leave marks that don't fade easily. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss powerful workplace injustice stories like this one, because every story shared here comes from moments that change lives in an instant. I found out I had been fired while lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to focus on the steady rhythm of the machines beside me. The room felt too quiet, too still, broken only by the soft hum of monitors and the occasional footsteps passing outside my door. I was still weak, drifting in and out of sleep, when my phone vibrated on the small table next to me. At first, I thought it was a message from family. Maybe someone checking in. I reached for it slowly, my arm heavy, and unlocked the screen. It was an email from HR. The subject line looked routine, formal, almost harmless. But the moment I opened it, the words hit harder than anything I'd felt since being admitted. Effective immediately. Position terminated. Organizational restructuring. I blinked, rereading it, convinced I had misunderstood. But the words didn't change. 12 years. 12 years in banking. Late nights. Weekend calls. Carrying pressure that most people never saw. I had always believed loyalty meant something. That if anything ever happened, there would at least be a conversation. A phone call. A chance to respond. Instead, I was lying in a hospital bed, barely strong enough to sit up, and my career had just ended through an email. No one had called. No one had asked how I was. No one had even warned me. Then I noticed the timestamp. The email had been sent only a few hours after I was admitted. I stared at the timestamp for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The email had been sent just 3 hours after I was admitted. 3 hours. That was barely enough time for the doctors to finish running tests and get me settled into the room. And yet, in that short window, someone at work had already decided my 12-year career was over. My chest tightened as I leaned back against the pillow. I tried to think clearly, but my head still felt foggy from medication. I hadn't even told most people I was in the hospital yet. Only my manager knew, and that was because I called him the moment I realized I wasn't going to make it in that morning. I remembered that call clearly. I had apologized for the sudden absence, explaining that I wasn't feeling well and needed to get checked out. He sounded concerned at the time. Told me to focus on getting better. Told me not to worry about anything at work. And then, just hours later, HR sent the email. I scrolled through it again, looking for something that made it feel less final. But it was all there. Benefits information. Return of company property. A number to call if I had questions. Everything written in that distant, professional tone that left no room for emotion. As I lowered the phone, one thought kept circling in my mind. This had moved too fast. Which meant someone had already been thinking about replacing me before I ever got sick. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind refused to slow down. The more I thought about it, the more the timing felt wrong. Decisions like this didn't happen in a few hours. Especially not after 12 years. There were always meetings, discussions, approvals. It took time. Unless the decision had already been made. I turned my head toward the window, the light outside dull and gray. I tried to replay the last week at work in my mind, searching for anything that felt different. The pressure had been building. Deadlines were tighter. And there was that one transaction I had been reviewing. A large one. It had come across my desk with an unusually urgent note attached. The numbers looked clean at first glance, but something about them didn't sit right. I remember opening earlier reports to compare, noticing small differences that didn't have clear explanations. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't escalate anything. I just paused. I told my manager I needed more time before I could approve it. That I wanted to double-check the figures before signing off. He hadn't argued, but I could tell he wasn't happy about the delay. That was the last real conversation we had. A sudden realization settled in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. The transaction I refused to approve was scheduled to move forward that same week. And the day I got hospitalized was the same day it was supposed to be finalized. I stared at the ceiling, letting that realization sink in slowly. The timing wasn't just unfortunate. It felt connected. That transaction had been sitting on my desk for days, and I had been going back and forth between reports, comparing figures, trying to understand why something felt off. It wasn't a massive difference. Just small shifts in totals that didn't line up with earlier versions. Enough to make me hesitate. Enough to make me pause before signing my name to it. And then I got sick. I remembered sitting at my desk the afternoon before I was admitted, flipping through the numbers one more time. My manager had stopped by and asked if everything was ready. I told him I needed more time. He didn't argue, but his silence felt heavier than words. Now, lying in this hospital bed, I realized I never got the chance to finish that review. My phone buzzed softly beside me, pulling me out of my thoughts. A message from a coworker. "Hey, I heard you're in the hospital. Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. I told her I was recovering and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that HR had fired me. The typing dots appeared almost instantly, then disappeared, then came back. Finally, a message popped up. "Wait, fired? I thought you were just on medical leave." I felt my chest tighten. So this hadn't been communicated to everyone, which meant something about this felt rushed inside the office too. I held the phone in my hand, waiting for another message to come through. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. "I'm so sorry," she wrote. "That doesn't make any sense." I thanked her, unsure what else to say. I didn't even fully understand it myself yet. Everything still felt unreal. But before I could put the phone down, another message appeared. "Quick question. Did you finish reviewing that large transaction before you got sick?" My fingers froze over the screen. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Then I typed slowly. "No." I paused it. I needed to double-check a few numbers. There was a long pause. I could see the typing dots appear, disappear, then appear again. When her message finally came through, it was shorter than before. Oh, just one word. But it felt heavy. I asked what was going on. She didn't respond right away. Nearly a full minute passed before the next message appeared. Leadership thought it was already approved. I felt a chill run down my spine. They thought I had signed off, which meant they believed everything had been verified. I stared at the phone, my heart starting to beat a little faster, because I knew for a fact I never approved it. I stared at the message, reading it over and over again. Leadership thought it was already approved. I sat there in silence, the hum of the machines around me suddenly louder than before. That transaction had never been cleared. I had paused it because the numbers didn't line up, and I wasn't willing to sign off until I understood why. I typed back slowly. "I never approved it. I was still reviewing." The reply came almost instantly. "Are you sure?" A strange question. Of course I was sure. Yes. I told my manager I needed more time. There was a long pause. I could see the typing dots appear, then disappear again. When her message finally came through, it felt heavier than anything she had said before. "That's a problem." My stomach tightened. I asked what she meant. Another pause. Then her message appeared. "It went through 2 days ago." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. 2 days ago. That meant the transaction had been finalized after I was hospitalized. After I had stepped away. After HR had already decided to terminate me. Which meant someone else had pushed it through. Someone had signed off on something I refused to approve. And now, lying in this hospital bed, I couldn't stop wondering why everything had moved so fast the moment I was out of the way. I held my phone tightly, trying to process what she had just told me. The transaction had gone through. Finalized. Completed. And I hadn't even been there to see what changed after I paused it. Who approved it? I typed. The response didn't come right away. Minutes passed. I could hear nurses talking faintly in the hallway, the sound of a cart rolling by. Everything felt strangely distant, like I was watching something unfold from far away. Finally, her reply appeared. "I don't know. It moved fast after you left." I closed my eyes for a moment. Fast. That was the word that kept coming back. Everything had moved fast. The approval. My termination. The silence afterward. I tried to think back to the last version I saw. I remembered writing down the totals in my notebook, comparing them to earlier reports. Something about them had bothered me enough to stop. Did the numbers change? I asked. Another pause. Then, people are saying they don't match the original projections anymore. I felt a cold heaviness settle in my chest. Because that was exactly what I was afraid of. And the only reason I never signed off was because something didn't feel right. I lowered my phone slowly, letting the weight of her words settle in. The numbers didn't match the original projections anymore. That was exactly what I had been worried about before everything happened. I had seen small differences. Subtle shifts that didn't have clear explanations. Not enough to sound an alarm, but enough to make me pause. And that pause had cost me my job. Or maybe it had protected something bigger. I stared at the ceiling again, replaying the last few days before I got sick. The pressure had been building for weeks. Urgent emails. Constant reminders about timelines. My manager stopping by my desk more often than usual, asking if the approval was ready yet. I had never seen him that focused on one transaction before. My phone buzzed again. People are trying to retrace the process now, my coworker wrote. They're looking for your comparison notes. My heart skipped. I had always kept handwritten notes when reviewing major approvals. Just totals. Dates. Version differences. It helped me catch patterns. That was how I noticed something was off in the first place. I wrote things down, I replied. Just for myself. Another pause. Then, do you still have them? I looked over at my bag sitting in the corner of the room. My notebook was inside it. The same notebook that held the last numbers I saw before everything changed. I reached for my bag slowly, careful not to pull at the 4 in my arm. The notebook was tucked inside, right where I left it. I flipped through the pages, my heart beating faster as I found the section from the week before I was admitted. Dates. Totals. Small notes in the margins. And one set of numbers circled twice. I remembered that night clearly. I had stayed late, comparing different versions of the report, trying to understand why the totals kept shifting. I never found a clear explanation. That was why I paused the approval. I snapped a photo of the page, making sure only my handwritten notes were visible, then sent it to her. A few minutes passed. Then my phone buzzed. This helps, she replied. They couldn't find this version anywhere. I frowned at the screen. What do you mean? Another pause. The system only shows the latest totals. Earlier ones are harder to track. I looked down at the numbers I had written. The earlier version. The one I questioned. Another message came through. They're trying to figure out when the first change happened. I stared at the date written next to the totals. Because I knew exactly when I first noticed something didn't add up. And it was days before I ended up in the hospital. I traced the date with my finger, the memory coming back clearly. It was 3 days before I was admitted. I had opened the report expecting a routine review, but the totals were slightly higher than what I remembered from the earlier version. Not dramatically different. Just enough to make me stop. I had written it down immediately. That was my habit. If something felt off, I documented it before checking further. I always planned to come back to it once I compared all the versions properly. My phone buzzed again. They're asking when you first noticed the difference, my coworker wrote. I snapped another photo, this time focusing on the date and the circled numbers. This was the first night I saw it, I replied. A few minutes passed before her response came through. That lines up with when the pressure started building. I sat up a little straighter. What pressure? I typed. Another pause. Leadership was pushing to finalize that transaction quickly. Faster than usual. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. So it wasn't just me. Other people had felt it too. Another message came through. They thought everything was already verified. I leaned back slowly. They believed I had finished the review, which meant they assumed the numbers were safe. And when I suddenly disappeared, they must have thought there was no reason to wait. I closed my eyes for a moment, the timeline forming more clearly in my mind. I noticed the first change. I paused the approval. I told my manager I needed more time. Then I got sick. I was hospitalized. And hours later, I was terminated. After that, the transaction was pushed through. The sequence felt too precise to ignore. My phone buzzed again. People are asking why the process slowed down right before it was finalized, she wrote. I swallowed slowly. Because I knew the answer. I stopped it, I replied. I wasn't comfortable signing off yet. There was a long pause. Then, that makes sense. I frowned slightly at the screen. What do you mean? Another message appeared. They're saying once you were gone, everything moved faster. My chest tightened. Of course it did. I had been the one holding it back. The one asking questions. The one comparing versions before approving anything. Without me there. No one paused. No one hesitated. Another message came through. Leadership is trying to understand what you saw before you got sick. I looked down at my notebook again. The circled totals. The notes. The dates. Because the truth was, I hadn't even finished figuring it out myself. I stared down at the notebook in my lap, the inked numbers suddenly feeling more important than they ever had before. At the time, they were just part of my routine. A way to stay organized. A way to make sure nothing slipped past me unnoticed. Now, they felt like pieces of something bigger. My phone buzzed again. They're trying to figure out what changed between the early reports and the final version, she wrote. No one can clearly trace it. I read the message twice. How is that possible? I asked. Don't they have version history? There was a longer pause this time. The system shows the latest totals. But earlier versions aren't easy to pull unless you know exactly where to look. I felt a slow chill move through me. That was exactly why I kept my own notes. I had learned early on that once figures were updated, the earlier numbers could get buried. Not lost, just harder to find. I never relied on memory. I wrote things down. Your notes are helping, she added. They're comparing what you wrote with what's showing now. I leaned back against the pillow, trying to process it all. So the only clear record of what those totals looked like before everything shifted was sitting in my lap. And I had written it days before I was hospitalized. Before I was fired. Before the transaction moved forward. I flipped through the notebook again, tracing the timeline with my eyes. Each page marked another step. Another check. Another comparison. I could almost feel myself sitting back at my desk, staying late, rechecking numbers long after everyone else had gone home. I remembered that night clearly. The office was quiet. Most of the lights were off. I had been comparing two versions of the report side by side, trying to understand why the totals didn't match earlier projections. It wasn't a massive difference. Just enough to make me hesitate. And I always trusted that hesitation. My phone buzzed again. They're asking if you noticed anything else unusual that week, she wrote. I thought back carefully. The pressure. The urgency. The constant reminders about deadlines. I was being asked to move faster, I replied. More than usual. A pause. Then. Yeah, everyone felt that. I frowned slightly at the screen. Why? I asked. The typing dots appeared. Then stopped. Then came back again. Finally, her message came through. I don't know. But leadership was really focused on getting that transaction done. I sat quietly, staring at the words. Because now, looking back, it felt like everything had been building toward that one moment. And the moment I slowed it down, I was suddenly gone. I set the notebook aside and stared out the hospital window, the late afternoon light dim and gray. The more I thought about that week, the clearer certain moments became. My manager had stopped by my desk more than usual. He hadn't been harsh or impatient, but there was a quiet urgency in the way he asked the same question over and over. Are we ready to finalize yet? Each time, I gave the same answer. Not yet. I needed to double-check the numbers. I wanted to compare one more version before approving anything. He would nod, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied. My phone buzzed again. They're trying to figure out exactly when the totals first changed, my coworker wrote. They think it happened before the final approval. I looked down at my notes again. I marked the first difference 3 days before I got sick, I replied. A few moments later, she answered. That's earlier than they thought. I felt my chest tighten slightly. That meant the shift had started before everything sped up. Before the pressure. Before I paused the review. Another message appeared. They're asking if you told anyone. I thought back carefully. I hadn't filed a report. I hadn't escalated it. I had only mentioned to my manager that I needed more time. I didn't get the chance to explain it fully, I typed. And suddenly, that unfinished conversation felt more important than ever. I leaned back against the pillow, exhaustion settling into my body, but my mind refused to slow down. The more pieces fell into place, the harder it was to ignore the pattern. I noticed the numbers shifting. I paused the approval. I asked for more time. Then I got sick. And hours later, I was terminated. My phone buzzed again. "They're going through reports from that week," she wrote. "Trying to track every update." I swallowed slowly. "Are they finding anything?" I asked. There was a longer pause this time. "Not clear yet. But they're asking who had the final responsibility for verifying everything." I closed my eyes for a moment. That had always been me. Not because of a title. Not because anyone assigned it that way. It was just how things worked. I was the one who compared versions. The one who made sure the numbers made sense before anything moved forward. And I hadn't signed off. Another message came through. "They're trying to understand why the process suddenly moved faster." I stared at the screen. Because I already knew the answer. The moment I was out of the way, there was no one left to slow it down. I let the phone rest on my chest, staring at the ceiling as the reality slowly settled in. For years, I had been the last set of eyes before anything major moved forward. I checked details others skimmed past. I compared versions. I paused when something didn't feel right. It was never about control. It was about responsibility. And now, suddenly, that final step had been removed. My phone buzzed again. "People are trying to retrace the approval chain," she wrote. "They're trying to see who signed off after you left." I felt a quiet tension build in my chest. "Do they know?" I asked. A pause. Then, "Not clearly." It all happened quickly. I thought about the timeline again. I got sick. I was admitted. HR terminated me. Then the transaction was approved. All within a very short window. Too short. "They must have assumed everything was already verified," I typed. Another pause. "Yeah," she replied. "That's what it sounds like." I closed my eyes for a moment. They thought I had finished. They thought the numbers were safe. They thought everything was ready to move forward. And the only reason it wasn't was because I stopped. And then I disappeared. The silence that followed her last message felt heavier than anything she had said. The messages stopped after that. For the first time in days, my phone stayed quiet. No new questions. No updates. No coworkers reaching out for numbers or notes. Just silence. At first, I thought maybe they had figured things out. Maybe they found what they were looking for. But the quiet didn't feel reassuring. It felt tense. Like something was happening behind the scenes that no one wanted to talk about yet. I tried to focus on resting, but my mind kept drifting back to the same thought. If I hadn't gotten sick, I would have finished that review. I would have compared the final version against the earlier numbers. I would have figured out why the totals kept shifting. I would have either signed off or stopped it completely. But I never got the chance. My phone lay on the table beside me, still and dark. Then suddenly, it buzzed. I reached for it slowly, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The screen lit up. HR. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the name, my mind racing. 3 days ago, they ended my career through an email. And now they were calling me. I let the phone ring once. Then twice. My first instinct was to ignore it. 3 days ago, they didn't think I was important enough to call. They didn't ask how I was. Didn't even wait for me to leave the hospital. They just sent an email and closed the door on 12 years of my life. But now they were calling. I took a slow breath and answered. "Hello." There was a short pause before a familiar voice spoke. Careful. Measured. Not cold like the email had been. "Laura, hi. It's HR." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what to say. My mind kept going back to that message. Effective immediately. No conversation. No warning. "I know this might be a difficult time," the voice continued. "But we were hoping to ask you something." Something. Not how I was feeling. Not if I needed support. Just something. I swallowed slowly. "What is it?" Another pause. "We're trying to reconstruct the timeline of the transaction you were reviewing before you went on leave." Went on leave. I almost corrected them. I hadn't gone on leave. I had been hospitalized. And then I had been fired. But instead, I stayed quiet. We've run into a few gaps, they continued. And we were told you kept detailed comparison notes. My heart started to beat faster. Because they didn't call to check on me. They called because they needed something. I tightened my grip on the phone, my mind racing. How do you know I kept notes? I asked carefully. There was a brief pause on the other end. Some of your colleagues mentioned that you tracked version changes manually, the voice replied. They said you were very thorough. Very thorough. It was strange hearing that now. No one had said anything like that the day they fired me. I kept personal notes, I said slowly. Just figures and dates. Nothing official. That's exactly what we're trying to understand, they replied, their tone tightening slightly. We can't clearly identify when the totals first shifted. I looked down at the notebook resting on my lap. The circled numbers. The dates. The differences I noticed before everything changed. And you think my notes can help? I asked. Another pause. Yes, they said quietly. You were the last person reviewing the transaction before it was finalized. The words hung in the air. The last person. That meant the approval moved forward after I was gone. Without my sign-off. Without my review. Laura, the voice continued carefully, do you remember what you saw before you paused it? I stared at the page in front of me. Because the truth was, I remembered exactly when the numbers first stopped making sense. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady my thoughts before answering. My eyes stayed fixed on the notebook in my lap, the same page open where I had circled the totals that didn't feel right. I noticed the first difference 3 days before I got sick, I said. The numbers were slightly higher than what I remembered from the earlier reports. There was a pause on the other end. Higher how? HR asked carefully. Not enough to trigger alarm, I replied. Just enough to make me stop and compare versions. That's why I didn't approve it right away. Silence followed. I could almost hear papers shifting in the background, like someone was taking notes. And then, the voice asked. I planned to recheck the final version the next morning, I said. But I never got the chance. Another pause. Longer this time. Laura, they said slowly, the transaction was finalized the day after you were admitted. My chest tightened. So it went through without my review? I asked. Yes. Just one word. Quiet. Careful. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. The numbers I hesitated on. The ones I never finished verifying. They were the ones that got approved. And I wasn't even there to question them. They used the last version in the system, HR continued. We're just trying to understand when the shift first started. I stared at the wall in front of me, my mind replaying the last morning I was at work. I remembered opening the file quickly before the day began, planning to continue where I left off. The totals had looked different again. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me pause. I saw another change the morning I got sick, I said quietly. There was a sharp silence on the line. What kind of change? HR asked. I didn't have time to compare everything properly, I replied. But the totals didn't match what I wrote down the night before. More silence. Then I heard someone whisper something in the background. So you never confirmed the final numbers? The voice asked carefully. No, I said. I was about to start the comparison when I had to leave. That moment felt heavier now than it had back then. At the time, it was just another delay. Another pause before signing off. Now it felt like the last chance to stop something. Laura, HR said slowly, the version approved that day was the one you never got to verify. My heart started beating faster. That meant the final numbers came from a version I never trusted. And no one else had stopped to question it. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, the steady hum of the hospital room suddenly fading into the background. Everything felt focused on that single conversation. So if the numbers don't match now, I said slowly, that means whatever I was checking was never fully verified. There was a long pause on the other end. We're still trying to understand exactly what happened, HR replied carefully. That's why we're asking you to walk us through what you noticed. I looked down at the notebook again, the inked numbers staring back at me like they had been waiting for this moment. I saw totals shifting between versions, I said. Nothing extreme. Just small increases that didn't line up with earlier projections. I paused because I wanted to know why. Another silence followed. Did you report it to anyone? The voice asked. I told my manager I needed more time, I said. I didn't want to raise concerns until I understood what I was looking at. The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear faint whispers in the background again. They're reviewing everything now, HR said, trying to figure out where the first discrepancy started. I felt my chest tighten, because I knew exactly where it began. I marked the first difference in my notes, I said quietly. 3 days before I was hospitalized. Another long pause. Then, more softly than before. That's earlier than we thought. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything they had said before. Earlier than we thought. That meant the problem had started long before the final approval. Long before I got sick. Long before the transaction moved forward. Laura, HR said, their voice noticeably more tense now, we need to ask you something directly. I straightened slightly in the bed. Okay. Another pause. Then, you were the last person who questioned the numbers before the transaction was finalized. The words settled slowly. The last person. I swallowed. I didn't question them, I said quietly. I just paused. I wanted to understand the changes first. We know, they replied. That's why we're trying to retrace what you saw. I looked at the notebook again, my fingers resting on the circled totals. Those small differences had felt insignificant at the time. Just another detail to check. Another version to compare. Now it sounded like those numbers were the key to everything. The current figures aren't lining up with the original projections, HR continued carefully. And we can't clearly determine when the shift first started. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because the truth was, I might have been the only person who noticed when it began. I held the phone in silence, letting that realization settle in. For weeks, I had been replaying the moment I got fired, trying to understand what I had done wrong. But now, listening to the tension in HR's voice, the story was starting to look very different. You think the changes started before the approval? I asked quietly. Yes, they said. And we're trying to determine when the first incorrect figures appeared. Incorrect figures. The words made my stomach tighten. I looked down at the notebook again, at the page where I had written the date beside the first totals that didn't feel right. I marked the night I noticed the first shift, I said slowly. 3 days before I got sick. There was another pause. Can you walk us through what made you hesitate? They asked. I took a breath. I was comparing versions, I said. The totals were slightly higher than earlier projections. It didn't make sense. I wasn't accusing anyone. I just didn't want to approve something until I understood it. Silence. Then, softly. That hesitation might have been important. I stared at the wall, the weight of that sentence pressing down on me. Because the only thing I had done was pause. And the moment I paused, everything around me started moving faster. The call lasted a few more minutes, but the tone never changed. It wasn't the same cold distance from the email that ended my career. It was careful now. Tense. Like they were trying to piece together something they didn't fully understand yet. Before hanging up, HR thanked me for the information. It felt strange hearing that word, thanked, after the way everything had ended. When the line went quiet, I set the phone down slowly and looked back at the notebook in my lap. 12 years in banking. 12 years of late nights, pressure, and responsibility. I had always believed I was just doing my job. Checking details. Slowing things down when something didn't feel right. Making sure nothing slipped through unnoticed. I never imagined that one moment of hesitation could matter so much. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't stopped the transaction. I hadn't made a scene. I just didn't approve it. And 3 days later, while I was lying in a hospital bed, I was removed. Now, weeks later, they were calling the one person who paused when the numbers didn't make sense. Because whatever changed after I was gone, no one else had caught it in time. And the only reason I didn't sign my name to it was because something inside me said to wait.